Over the course of nearly 2 years, from the October of 2022 to October of 2024, Ukrainian forces stationed in the city of Vuhledar waged a seemingly unending battle against the invading Russian forces. In what would eventually come to be known as the Battle of Vuhledar, thousands would be killed, wounded or go missing, as armoured trucks, tanks and infantry sought to overpower the opposition on either side. Ukrainian commanders would dub the Battle of Vuhledar as the largest tank battle of the Russo-Ukrainian War to date. They certainly held their own against Russian forces for a long while, and the surrounding region actually changed hands at multiple key points across the battle's duration. But how did the key events of this great battle play out? Who would emerge victorious, and would they remain in this position? In today's video, we will be taking a look at the infamous Battle of Vuhledar, examining the armies of both sides before breaking down exactly how the conflict was carried out. This is the Battle of Vuhledar. Welcome to Wars of the World. In March of 2022, just 1 month after Russia had launched their full-scale invasion of Ukraine, with forces trickling in from the east, the south and the north, Ukrainian forces retreated from the city of Vuhledar, one of the easternmost cities in the region of Donetsk Oblast. This was one of the first large settlements to be evacuated as Russian forces advanced. Stationed here was the Ukraine's 53rd Mechanized Brigade, containing artillery units, tanks, rifle battalions and anti-aircraft defense. As the units retreated from Vuhledar, they relocated to the city of Vuhledar, just less than an hour's drive to the northwest. While stationed here, they were tasked with defending the city from any Russian forces who would march on Vuhledar from the newly captured Vuhledar. But they would also attempt to retake any nearby settlements that were now under Russian control. On the 21st of June 2022, units from the 53rd Mechanized Brigade began to march south into the nearby village of Pavlivka, and they succeeded in taking it from the relatively small Russian presence stationed there. This tiny village, consisting of just 2,500 people, soon became a hotbed of gunfire and tank shelling, becoming the very front line of the war. The recapture effort was completed relatively quickly, and units from Russia's 8th Naval Infantry Brigade, who had teamed up with Ukrainian separatist paramilitary forces, were forced to retreat. This was by no means the last fighting that would take place in Pavlivka, however. Several months later, in October of 2022, Russian forces returned in an attempt to wrestle control of the village once more. Taking Pavlivka would be a strategic advantage to the Russians, giving them access to several major settlements nearby, eventually including Vuhledar. Russian infantry gradually emerged from the south and the east, from the villages of Yehorivka and Mikilsk, settlements they had captured prior to their taking of Pavlivka. What happened next is considered to be the first step towards the impending Battle of Vuhledar, although there was still a long road ahead. Speculation from both sides of the battle noted that Russians' attempt to recapture Pavlivka may have been an effort to corral Ukrainian troops in and around Vuhledar. Once Pavlivka had been retaken, they could easily access the city in a circle formation, essentially blocking them in, and preventing anyone from fleeing to a nearby settlement, while they attempted to retake the larger city. In fact, Russian efforts to encircle the city had already begun by the time they marched on Pavlivka. Units from the Russian Pacific Fleet had started to conduct minor assaults around the village of Novo-Mikhailivka, just north of Vuhledar. They didn't manage to gain a foothold on the city from these assaults alone, and so it became apparent that a more direct approach, entering via Pavlivka, would be the key to their success. Amongst the Russians' arsenal was the 2S4 Tilpan self-propelled heavy mortar, the largest mortar system on the battlefield today. With this, combined with their infantrymen and armour, they would be able to rain down constant fire on Pavlivka, encouraging the Ukrainian army to retreat. By the end of October, Russian forces announced that Pavlivka was partially under their control, but footage from the region shows a strong Ukrainian presence until at least the beginning of November. Reportedly, by the beginning of November, any fighting around the town of Pavlivka had slowed down into a series of minor skirmishes, while Ukrainian soldiers claimed that poor winter weather had slowed down the assault. Heavy snow and rain would make it almost impossible for Russian troops to enter Pavlivka without damaging their vehicles, while sub-zero temperatures all but stopped the soldiers in their tracks. Much of what followed regarding the assault on Pavlivka comes from Russian sources, and it can be inferred that across the course of November, the 155th Naval Infantry managed to slowly make their way into the village, pushing the Ukrainian soldiers back to Pavlivka's northern limits. On the 13th and 14th of November, Russian forces announced that they had killed or captured most of the Ukrainian soldiers who were unable to flee, and by the 17th had claimed to have wrestled full control over Pavlivka. Still, by at least the 23rd of November, there was still evidence of a slight Ukrainian presence holed up in the north. It is thought that during the assault on Pavlivka, Russia's troops lost as many as 300 men, and according to David Axe, the military correspondent to Forbes magazine, members of the 155th Naval Infantry were disgruntled. They saw the assault on the village as extremely risky. The Ukrainians fought hard, and conditions were unsuitable for fighting. Meanwhile, Nazary Kishak, a Ukrainian commander who had survived the assault at Pavlivka, claimed that the Russians had lost over 400 men in their assault. Doctors working in the nearby towns orbiting Pavlivka reportedly received as many as 60 Ukrainian casualties each day of the fighting, and although the Russians succeeded in pushing them back to Vuhledar, it was by no means an easy victory. When Russian forces overpowered the Ukrainians at Pavlivka, they did indeed flee to the nearby city of Vuhledar. As of the beginning of 2022, its population was just over 14,000. Vuhledar is primarily a coal mining city, and was initially intended to be a major economic centre within the country, undergoing a great deal of development in the 1960s. However, it did not meet expectations, and at the time the Battle of Vuhledar ensued, it was seen as a minor economic node, with a few major cultural centres. It sits on an elevated plain, with slightly better weather conditions than Pavlivka, and lies around 35 miles from a major city, Donetsk. By January of 2023, Russian forces under the command of Colonel General Rustam Muradov, Major General Sukrab Akhmedov, and Major General Mikhail Gudkov had begun to amass their forces to launch a major assault on Vuhledar. In their arsenal, which again belonged to the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, was around 20,000 troops, 90 battle tanks, 180 infantry fighting vehicles, and over 100 artillery pieces. The number of Ukrainian forces stationed within the limits of Vuhledar is at this time unknown. However, there would be enough of a presence to effectively hold off the Russian army for a considerable amount of time. The assault was launched on the night of the 24th of January, just after dark, with fighting commencing early on the 25th. From the get-go, it looked like Russian forces were making major advances. They had obliterated the Ukrainians' first line of defense towards the southeastern entrance of the city, and many of the men defending their position here were forced to retreat further within the urban center. Across the remainder of the day, localized offensive missions were launched by the Russian forces. But this is where they began to struggle. They would temporarily take ground held by the Ukrainians, only to lose it almost immediately. This continued well into the following day, where the spokesman for Ukraine's Eastern Command, Serhiy Cherevachyi, noted that Ukrainian forces had fought 58 individual battles against small groups of Russian troops. As intended, the Russians had attempted to encircle Vuhledar, and another attack was beginning to emerge from the city's western border. Battles on the western front proved to be more successful for the defending Ukrainians than those on the east, and they were able to hold their position despite constant artillery fire and shelling from tanks. On the 26th of January, Cherevachyi claimed that 109 Russians had been killed in battle, with a further 188 being wounded. On the 27th of January, Russian forces retaliated against the western side of the city with fire from a TOS-1 thermobaric rocket launcher. These rocket launchers were mounted on Russian tanks stationed outside the city and could repeatedly rain down warheads on their target. Still, the Ukrainian soldiers managed to hold their position, and it seemed like the Russians were the ones taking the heaviest losses in these early days. British intelligence collected at the very end of January revealed that Russian forces were struggling to make significant progress into the city itself. By the 28th of January, Ukrainian soldiers claimed to have brought down 6 of the Russians' Ka-52 helicopters, and rumors were beginning to surge that Russian casualties were far surpassing those on the Ukrainian side. While this was an exaggeration, several hundred Russian troops had been killed when Ukrainian forces struck a building where soldiers had been gathering. By all accounts, the Ukrainian forces were successfully defending their city. They even managed to destroy 30 tanks with their artillery, as the Russians attempted yet another assault on the western front. Over the course of the next few days, from around the 6th of February onwards, Russian forces continued to advance and retreat, seemingly finding it difficult to gain a foothold in Vuhledar. By the second week of February 2023, Russian morale was low. Colonel General Rustam Muradov, the man in charge of commanding the assault on Vuhledar, was coming under fire from his commanding officers for failing to take the city quickly. Moreover, Ukrainian sources were claiming that hundreds of Russian soldiers were falling in battle each day. Whether these numbers are exaggerated or not remains to be seen, but the Russian army certainly wasn't having an easy time in breaching the city. Furthermore, a video appeal to the Russian President Vladimir Putin soon appeared online, which appeared to show members of a Russian unit stationed at Vuhledar. In this video, they claimed that Muradov had been employing the use of anti-retreat troops in order to maintain discipline and prevent the front line from abandoning their position. In the video, the soldiers claimed that heavy losses had indeed been experienced. 304 of their squad alone had been killed, including their commander, with another 22 being seriously injured. For the remainder of February and March, the Russians continued their attempt to advance into Vuhledar, primarily utilizing tanks and artillery to shell the Ukrainians out of their hiding places. By March, it was reported that the Russian army had lost so many of their tanks in these initial weeks of battle that they were forced to send in ground infantry in great numbers, with little cover from shelling. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians had reportedly become adept at ambushing the Russians from within the city, using drones and anti-tank missiles to repel continuous waves of soldiers. As Russian infantrymen marched into the city, the Ukrainians still managed to repel them. On the 14th of March, Ukrainian forces discovered a notebook belonging to a fallen Russian officer who had detailed multiple impending waves of assault on Vuhledar. He had gone into detail on where and when the attacks would take place, and just how many soldiers would be deployed. To the Ukrainians, this was simply a blessing. They could now prepare for the next few waves of soldiers and allocate their resources accordingly. The first wave came on the 2nd of March, when 100 Russian soldiers attempted to breach Ukrainian lines. The Ukrainians, however, held their own, and only 16 Russians survived. Just 2 days later, another 116 Russian soldiers were sent in. Only 23 returned. That very same day, a part of 103 soldiers assaulting the city lost all but 15 men. And the day after, 3 survivors made it back to camp from a squad of 115. By the 3rd of April, Rustam Muradov had been dismissed from the battlefield. This made international headlines. All the while, Ukrainian generals began providing the media with photos of destroyed Russian tanks, and reports that the defense remained strong. Over the course of April, Ukrainian soldiers had begun capturing Russian troops as they entered the city, and casualties continued to mount. However, as April turned to May, the Russians seemed to gain something of an advantage. They had now been surrounding Vuhledar for several months, which had seriously taken its toll on Ukrainian forces within. As such, the Ukrainians were beginning to run out of resources, and the Russians still outnumbered them greatly. They had hammered the Russian army with fire for the best half of a year, but could they maintain their position in the face of waning ammunition and weaponry? The year that followed showed a series of victories for the Ukrainian side, mainly as they continued to destroy any tanks that made their way into the outskirts of the city. A large-scale offensive was attempted in November of 2023, where the Russian 155th Marine Brigade, armed with T-72B3 and T-80BV tanks, rolled into Vuhledar. The Ukrainians hit back with everything they had, which proved to be not only enough to repel Russian forces temporarily, but was the single deadliest day of fighting at this point in the battle. Almost 1,000 Russian lives were thought to have been lost on the 2nd day of November, and 60 vehicles had been destroyed. The Ukrainians, however, had lost just 17 vehicles. These successes continued into 2024, as the Russians launched wave after wave of tank assaults. It was only a matter of time, however, before the Ukrainians met their match. In August of 2024, Russia began to reconsider its approach to taking over the city of Vuhledar. They shipped in additional artillery and new turtle tanks with extra defensive capabilities. They bombarded the city on a daily basis, and around this time, Ukrainian forces began to report on how intense these new attacks had become. Nothing else like it had been seen in the war to date. Moreover, Russian forces began to close in around the coal mines located to the northeast of the city, and by September 2024, they had begun to tighten their hold on the surrounding areas too. To the west, the Russian army had managed to seize the village of Prechestivka, which they had claimed as their own by the 5th of September. A huge column of armoured vehicles had rolled into the village and taken it with relative ease, while most of the Ukrainian attention was focused on repelling the assault at Vuhledar. Shortly after, the same group of Russian forces had captured Vuhledar, another village, even closer to the western flank of Vuhledar. For the Russians, it was all going to plan. These new tactics of upping the bombardments of Vuhledar, while they silently took the villages around the city, allowed them to encapsulate the Ukrainian forces, and by the 8th of September, they were fully surrounded. Moreover, halfway through the month of September, the Russians had launched an offensive near the strategically advantageous city of Pokrovsk, and Ukrainian troops had been removed from Vuhledar in order to repel the Russian invaders on this new front. Now, with constant shellings, a position that had seen them become completely encircled by the enemy, and with dwindling numbers, the Russians had the advantage. What's more is that the remaining troops left in Vuhledar were completely exhausted. The Russians had afforded them little reprieve since the February of 2022. Fighting was taking place almost daily, and resources continued to wane as a result. They were now in dire need of air defense, which they would not be able to receive due to the massive Russian presence on their doorstep. By the end of September, Ukrainian troops were beginning to feel the threat of thousands of Russian soldiers gathering all around them. From every corner of the city, tanks, artillery and infantry began to pour in, and the fighting only seemed to get more severe day by day. On the 22nd of September, Russian forces managed to fight their way past the Ukrainians' lines of defense, pushing them back further into Vuhledar. International speculation now began to state that it was only a matter of days before the city would fall to Russian command. When the Russians launched their final offensive to capture the city, they were swift and fierce. The troops that had recently taken the village of Prechestivka had approached Vuhledar's western flank, where they were met with soldiers arriving from the south by way of Pavlivka. Pushing against the Ukrainians that were making last-ditch attempts to repel the invaders, the Russians managed to breach into the city from the west, and by the 13th of September had pressed into the heart of the city. Still, the Ukrainians fought hard, and the Russians did not immediately manage to overpower them. While many remained and fought against the enemy, it became increasingly apparent that Vuhledar would soon fall to the Russian army, and evacuation efforts needed to be put into place. Small squadrons of soldiers began making authorized and calculated attempts to exit the city, using the few angles not yet breached by Russian soldiers. Attempts to flee were risky, and needed to be timed correctly to weave in and out of constant artillery fire and the arrival of new infantrymen. Several of these evacuation attempts ended in disaster, and many Ukrainians are thought to have fallen at the last hurdle as they attempted to leave Vuhledar and get to safety. Moreover, the 123rd Territorial Brigade, a Ukrainian defense force tasked with reinforcing the positions of the evacuating soldiers as they left, deserted their positions without approval. This impacted the soldiers and their evacuation attempts greatly, as there were now very few troops left in the city to defend it, and those that were awaiting evacuation were now in danger. By the 1st of October, Russian troops had fought their way into the streets of Vuhledar's city centre, where the last few Ukrainian troops who had not yet evacuated were still holding up. Later that very same day, the city was formally declared as captured, and the Russian military had won the battle. The last few soldiers defending Vuhledar were composed of units from the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, and those that had not deserted from the 123rd Territorial Brigade. The commander of the latter, Igor Hryb, was killed on the 2nd of October 2024, just after the Russians had conquered the city. His cause of death was ruled to have been self-inflicted following Vuhledar's capture. The following day, on the 3rd of October, the Russian Ministry of Defense would formally announce the capture of Vuhledar. The day belonged to the Russians. With Vuhledar now under Russian command, the army was able to make significant advances to the north and northwest. The strategic positioning of the city allowed them to march much further into Ukraine, and by November of 2024, they had succeeded in taking the settlements of Bohoyavlenka, Novokrenka, Yasna Polyana, Shakhtarsk, and Maximivka. The next significant large-scale operation in the region came in the form of the Velika Novosilka offensive, where Russian forces attempted to control the Ukrainian town of the same name. The attack began formally in November of 2024, with soldiers using their strategic position at Vuhledar to launch a wave of attacks that would last until January 2025. This would again result in a Russian victory, as they took part in flanking maneuvers from the east and west, weaving their way into buildings to capture the town piece by piece. They employed a similar tactic to the one seen in the Battle of Vuhledar, encircling the town from the other settlements that they had previously captured, before closing in and breaking through the Ukrainian defensive lines. So what happened to Vuhledar? The city had been well and truly ravaged by war across the almost 2-year offensive which was launched against it, and during that time it received almost constant artillery and tank fire. In February of 2023, just a few weeks into the start of the large-scale fighting in the city, Ukrainian Deputy Mayor Verbovsky had said that Vuhledar had been destroyed. 100% of the buildings, he noted, had been damaged by shelling and bombing, and for those within, life was hard. While evacuation attempts for Vuhledar's civilians had been in place just before the Russian offensive began, many lost their lives in the attacks, and by the time the battle was over, its former population of 15,000 had been reduced to just 500. Following the battle, the city lay in ruins, with no running water or electricity. Colonel General Rustam Muradov was reportedly demoted from his position as the commander of the Eastern Military District following his removal from the Vuhledar offensive. This was not confirmed by the Russian military itself, but by Mikhail Zvinchuk, the head of Rybar, a Russian military analysis organization. According to Zvinchuk, Muradov had essentially been given orders tantamount to an entire resignation, and little has been heard from him since. In his place was appointed Lieutenant General Andrei Kuzmenko, who served as the commander of the Eastern Military District up until May 2024, when he in turn was replaced by Colonel General Alexander Sanchik. Once the Battle of Vuhledar was in full swing, and after it came to an explosive close, international speculation, attention, and analysis began to flow in, commenting on how the Russians won victory over the city and how the battle was able to play out as it did. The American Institute for the Study of War, a non-profit research group headquartered in Washington, D.C., believed that the Battle of Vuhledar single-handedly stopped the Russians from advancing further into Ukraine across the tail end of 2023, due to the losses that they had experienced on their tanks and armoured vehicles. Supposedly, the Russians were unable to advance into the surrounding villages due to the Ukrainian efforts at Vuhledar. From the Ukrainian perspective, the Battle of Vuhledar is thought to have been the biggest tank battle of the Russo-Ukrainian War to date. A total of 130 Russian tanks were destroyed or heavily damaged while the battle waged on. International analysts believe that the Russians found it so hard to gain a foothold on the city before their change in tactics, due to the fact that many of their men were untrained, mobilized recruits who had previously seen very little action on the battlefield. The Wall Street Journal speculated that these junior soldiers found it hard to adapt to changes on the battlefield, especially when storming the city in continuous wave after wave. Moreover, it is thought that they had received minimal training of subpar quality before they were deployed to fight at Vuhledar. As of 2025, however, the tide may be turning once again. In April, Ukrainian forces managed to retake control of a village by the name of Dnipro-Energia, a stone's throw from the city of Vuhledar. Forces that are being led by Lieutenant General Sergei Neyev, commander of the Vuhledar Tactical Group, have managed to gain a slight foothold on the region once more. In an interview with the New Voice of Ukraine, he claims to have reduced personnel losses by 20% during the time he has been attempting to reclaim the region for Ukraine, and he estimates that a further 51 Russian tanks have been destroyed. There is some potential here for Russian war efforts around the city of Vuhledar to be reversed, but only time will tell if so, and by how much. The taking of Vuhledar was a significant point in the Russo-Ukraine war that continues to be waged to this day. With the capture of the city, the Russians were able to gain an advantage, but the fight continues, and the Ukrainians have certainly given the Russian army a run for their money. As time progresses further into 2025 and eventually 2026, the world continues to observe and analyze the fighting, while international aid is being afforded to the Ukrainian fighters who defend against the Russian attack. Where the war goes from here, we will just have to wait and see.